Hello everyone, today I will be discussing Mega Man Xtreme 1 and 2. Both games were on the Game Boy Color. Since they have Xtreme in the title, how am I supposed to know if they're extreme? Well, I'll start with Xtreme 1, then I'll do Xtreme 2, then I'll discuss how both games could have been better. Let's see how both games hold up. Oh, and be prepared to see my cursor in the Burkana scene. I am very sorry about that and I heavily apologize. Next time it won't be like that again. Blah 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 blah. I don't care about this! So this game takes place between X2 and X3 while using content from the first two games. From the opening stage, to the title theme, to the final boss. Since this is the Game Boy, you can press start or double tap left or right to dash, but regardless, there's not much to talk about. I would actually like to start by talking about the story. Basically something called the mother computer stops working, and X has to go fix it where he faces 4 Mavericks, enters the core, and goes through the castle to fight Sigma, who is easy to fight. Can I talk about the cutscenes for a minute? You cannot skip them like you can in X1 through X3. Instead, you have to mash through the text, which can be quite painful. While I can fast forward on my emulator, some people that are playing on the actual Game Boy are probably going to be irritated by this. The game is split into 2 modes, which I'll get to later, and you do the same stuff on each mode. So why isn't there much to talk about? Here's why. This game is just material from other games slapped into the Game Boy, minus the new characters and all that stuff. By the way, Zing and Gemmel are very easy and predictable. They have the same reward, which is nothing. There are some parts that I actually like about this game. I like how you can have auto charge and rapid fire, which makes things much easier. It's just simply less button mashing. However, this only works with the X-Buster, which is kind of lame. The Hadouken and Shoryuken are actually super easy to pull off. You can just charge shot while holding down or up to do either move, even though they don't kill bosses in one hit. I'm glad you don't have to do any button combinations or have full health, thankfully. The graphics are actually pretty good, and there's a pretty good use of color, and the music is far from terrible, and while obviously it's not as good as in the Super Nintendo games, they're still pretty good. However, the theme for the second castle stage is much shorter. Listen to this! I think the level design isn't really that bad despite the Game Boy's lower resolution, and not too many stages really felt cramped, minus Armored Armadillo stage, as well as fighting Boss Spider. Those were times where the Game Boy games did feel a bit crunched up. I think it would be better if the stages were designed for the Game Boy screen resolution. Let's not forget the characters that appear out of nowhere. Where else do they come from? They're literally just here for the plot! Come on, Capcom. The last complaint I'm going to talk about is the platform in the second castle stage. It's pretty fast for level design and has a very bad hitbox. And it gets even worse. You actually needed to get to the Shoryuken and the Hadouken. Like, seriously guys, you can't even go without it. So yeah, it can be painful getting there. As much as I would want to mention more parts that I don't like about Xtreme, I'm not gonna go that far because I don't want to sound or even feel like I'm bashing the game, because that's kind of mean. I actually like how some of the bosses don't repeat their pattern when you use their weakness, aside from Spark Mandrill. I would also like to mention that this game is split into 2 modes. Normal mode has Storm Eagle, Spark Mandrill, Chill Penguin, and Flame Stag, and it's the mode with the armor upgrades from X1. Hard mode has Armored Armadillo, Wheel Gator, Magna Centipede, and Morph Moth, as well as these capitals with these zero moves, which I almost never used. There's an unlockable Extreme mode, which is both modes combined and no cutscenes, and yes, I did manage to beat that mode during my trip to Italy. Overall, it's like what Michael from Metropolis Zone said in Jay's review for this game. It's mostly material that was copied and pasted from other games, and there's not much of a place for this game since there's the Legacy Collection for the Switch if you want to play the X games on the go. However, you can play this game on the 3DS via Virtual Console. You can look further into that if you watch Jay's review for this game, in case you're wondering what Michael from Metropolis Zone is, or who he is. Anyway guys, let's talk about the second game, shall we?
Let me start by saying, the story is pretty simple. Reploids have lost their souls, causing them to stop moving, and X and Zero have to free the souls. Who's responsible for the mess? The characters Gareth and Bracana, who have much better introductions than these dudes. They also have cool designs. What more could you want?
Again, unlike Xtreme 1, the game uses Mavericks from the first 3 games despite the game taking place between X3 and X4, but the stages are much more original, except for Launch Octopus, Flame Mammoth, and Wire Sponge, which I don't have footage for and I'll get to them later. There's also something called Part in a stage select where you can make yourself stronger. You probably might want to do that because some bosses are easier but harder at the same time. Their attack patterns are a bit easier except Wire Sponge, but you don't get much space to avoid them compared to the big screen titles. The fact that there are more original stages make this game much better than Xtreme 1. There are some parts in certain stages like elements from Steam Chameleon stage to Neon Tiger stage, but it's still quite interesting to have a bit more originals into it. However, the rising lava and the flowing water make the game much slower, and this can be a big pain. And plus, you're probably going to want to make some save states if you're running this on an emulator, especially if you're trying to get that heart tank like I was. The graphics are still pretty good, and the introductions are a little more impressive, actually much more impressive. The music is better, but worse at the same time. Some of the themes are actually shorter. Here's one of the themes. So while I don't want to make this over an hour, I would actually like to talk about the armor upgrades. It's basically the second and third armor combined with the design of the second armor. While in the air, you can press A to air dash, and you can dash upwards by pressing A when holding up. Same for Zero. You have 2 kinds of charge shots, one that's a spread shot and one that's a single big shot. What might not make sense is that the big shot works when you're moving. Let's also discuss the Sigma stages. One of the stages has a resemblance to the second castle stage in X1, with the boss being Velgarder. Remember him? There's also one that feels a little cramped with a few blind jumps, and that leads to this horrible thing. Isas and Sowilo. I don't know if I'm about to say a swear word because personally I don't swear, but this boss is a turd. There are 2 weak spots, its faces, and it's way too big for the Game Boy screen resolution, at least in my opinion. He also hits very hard, even with slow motion on my emulator RetroArch. I managed to take it down by starting over with a full sub-tank, but that boss was just a pain in the butt. Did Capcom seriously think that boss was a good idea, or was ever well done, or anything like that? Did they seriously approve of this? Like, someone at Capcom should have said, hey, you're overthinking this is way too large for the Game Boy screen resolution. So, yeah. Another boss that's a pain is Bracana, the last boss in the X mission, while her brother Gareth is the last boss in the Zero mission. In Extreme mode, it's Sigma. She's not broken, but it took a long time. She can shoot 2 kinds of magic shots, which correspond to the Game Boy's A and B buttons. There's Magic Shot A, which makes X unable to jump, and Magic Shot B, which makes him unable to shoot. So not only she's designed like a witch, but she also attacks like one. It took so long that I got very tired and I ended up making save states. So yeah, the Wicked Witch of the West, or Rita/Bandora for Power Rangers, on steroids. So after I finished one of the missions, I stopped recording due to that stupid tank boss. Finishing one of the missions lets you finish the other mission with everything you collected in the mission that you already finished. In this case, I can do the Zero mission with everything I got in the X. Now let's talk about how Xtreme 1 and 2 could have been better. One good solution would be to have more original bosses. It's cool to fight bosses from other games, but could we have at least some original bosses? This is even worse than the case with Mega Man and Bass, and that was around 1998. Another good solution would be to have these games released on the Game Boy Advance. While Xtreme 1 did come in 2000, at least in Japan, which was much before the GBA, if not way before, it was pretty close to the original Game Boy's deadline, so the Game Boy Advance would have made more sense than the original Game Boy. Speaking of the Game Boy, instead of something like Xtreme 1 and 2, we could have had Game Boy or Game Boy Color versions of the X games. In this case, X1 through X5. And I mean at the time the X games were being made, not in 2000. While they wouldn't age well, which I could be wrong about, it would be a much better idea than Xtreme 1 and 2, at least in my opinion.
Another solution would be to make the sprites a bit smaller than they actually were, especially this thing. The bosses are pretty tough for how big the sprites are, even though many of them are much slower. An example would be when Wire Sponge stayed mad after half of his health was destroyed. It took quite a long time to fight him, but I eventually managed to get through that.
Overall, both games are not worth your time. They're not bad, but they're not great. Xtreme 1 dropped the ball by using so much content from the first two X games, and Xtreme 2 did fix that, but I feel that it's not enough. But hey, they could have been more successful and better if they had more original content than what they actually had, and if they were released on a Game Boy Advance or some other system that had a bigger install base or a bigger audience at the time. Or if it released years before 2000 and 2001. And yeah, that's pretty much it for these two games. Oh, and picture how a consumer would react at the time.
I swear to God, if this game is not Xtreme, I am done with you, Capcom. I really am!
So, I hope you all did not mind this review at all. Maybe someday I will actually be able to redo these two games. Next game will be something more original, which will be this!
Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation. From Konami.
That's right, Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, PSP, Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network, and also the PS4, along with Rondo of Blood. Fantastic graphics, fantastic music, and interesting gameplay despite the inspiration from Super Metroid. And yes, I plan to review movies like First Man, for example. So be sure to stay tuned for my review of Symphony of the Night, and thank you for watching too. Also, be sure to subscribe or contact me on Discord, link in the description. See you guys next time. Bye everyone.